Hi. We're several weeks past Easter, and yet Judas Iscariot, this critical character in the Passion of Christ, continues to come back in my mind as events transpire around me. Now, Judas Iscariot is described in the Gospels, both the Synoptics and John's, as the betrayer of Jesus. He is the figure who identified Jesus to the temple guards for his, Jesus, arrest. Here is how Luke describes that betrayal. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Then later, while Jesus was still speaking, a crowd came up. And the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" This could be viewed simply as the story of a snitch, a person choosing silver over loyalty. That is all it is if you choose for it to be. However, I believe there is more to it than that. As with most scripture, the story of Judas is a much bigger story. It is more than just betrayal. What else do we know about Judas? Well, we know he was the son of a man named Simon. We know he was an early follower of Jesus and called Jesus rabbi or teacher. This is significant. My understanding is that at that time, and we're talking 1st century Common Era or AD, at that time, those who followed a rabbi were making a radical choice. The act of following a rabbi was, in fact, a decision to take on that rabbi's yoke, to live in total community with him. Everything indicates that Judas lived up to that commitment. Some would say zealously, until the very end. You see, Judas zealously believed things about the promised Messiah. He believed the Messiah would be a warrior king, like David. He believed the Messiah would drive the Romans out of the promised land and would reestablish the kingdom of David as it had been 1,000 years before. He was not alone. In the context of 1st century Judea, zealotry wasn't just a political stance. It was a deeply reinforced cultural belief, something psychologists might call a learned autopilot, a learned instinctive process. In that culture, in those times, the Messiah was intuitively understood to be a Davidic conqueror, a physical liberator who would override Roman authority with Jewish sovereignty. Within that culture, every prayer, every historical retelling, and every Roman provocation reinforced the zealot impulse. For Judas, the intuitive thing to do when faced with oppression was to strike back, not turn the other cheek. Clearly, among the 12 disciples, and perhaps amongst all of the followers of Jesus, Judas was not alone in these beliefs at the start. He was possibly simply the most fervent. And I believe Jesus chose him to be a follower, fully knowing his nature, his convictions, and how he would react. A somewhat trivial example is that as a father, I know how my children react when stimulated, good and bad. A lesson from the story of Judas, beyond the betrayal, is that our zealous nature is often hardwired. We have to make cognitive choices, do acts of free will to act otherwise than our nature would have us act. And that is harder for some than for others. I believe it is harder for some than others because we are each wired a bit differently. For me, beyond his betrayal of Jesus, the story of Judas points me to a better understanding of the nature of zealotry. And I offer 3 lessons I've learned regarding zealotry from the story of Judas. First, my most strongly held beliefs may be wrong. You know, those beliefs I have the strongest learned autopilot regarding. Judas was sure he knew the character of the promised Messiah. But when Jesus proclaimed his identity, his character, his gentleness, his kindness, his servant nature was so at odds with what Judas expected that the dissonance was possibly more than Judas, by his nature, could handle. This was despite the fact that Jesus declared, had shown proof, and was decidedly not just the Son of God, but God himself. Second, the others changed. The disciples who started their relationship with Jesus with the same beliefs as Judas allowed themselves to be transformed. They followed the rabbi, even though he was doing a new thing. 11 of 12 changed, but 1 of 12 did not. We need to think about that every time we consider how to deal with teams, with groups, and even with families. Third lesson. I am as much like Judas as I am like Peter. I can follow my intuition, do what feels right. I can demand my personal autonomy to deal with any dissonance as I choose. But to avoid Judas's path of rejection, betrayal, and ultimately suicidal sadness, I have to maintain an open mind. have to order my beliefs. I have to subordinate my self-interest. And I have to be willing to hear new information. Judas's story reminds me that, like Peter, I am called to embrace change while remaining steadfast in my understanding of God and purpose and virtue. It is never either or. It is always both. Something I say to Christians who reject science as being unaligned with the God of their Bible: get a bigger God. The God who created the universe is big enough to be reflected in anything and everything that science finds. See, I am commanded to live a balanced life, balancing zeal with openness to new information. This is not easy. That's why it's such an important story to understand Judas. Good things are never easy. This I believe. Aloha.